from Charles in both games. I know we were kind of a little excited about the Dragon deck, but the Vampires deck kind of did what makes it a very powerful staple in the Pioneer format right now. It just wound up kind of going for disruption, removal, clearing the way with those in order to land a Fable the Mirror Breaker on game number 1, which then found the Vein Ripper in addition to the Sorin that Charles just kept in his hand, even though there were a bunch of big dragons and multiple Silumgar Scorns. Sorry, not the Sorin, the Vein Ripper that he was able to play out. The Silumgar Scorns could not counter the Cavern of Souls Vein Ripper. He just bought enough time for himself to survive, was not under a big threat from that Goldspan Dragon. And then in game number 2, we kind of got a chance to see the deck do its thing. It was kind of goldfishing. Once you took away the Fable of the Mirror Breaker from the Dragon's deck, it didn't have the ability to restock its hand. It just had a couple of Fatal Pushes, which didn't really do anything against Sorin plus Vein Ripper.
Yeah, a bit unfortunate too how the hand was playing out for Eric on the Dragons. Just like 4 lands into another land to another land, is not really having any hand besides the double push, the Fable, and then eventually another Fable in the hand. So we didn't really see what the Dragon deck did bring in. Maybe it was the pushes, or maybe it did play binding. We're not too sure, but we just saw Vampires play its game.
Yeah. I mean, from the Dragon deck side, there wasn't a lot of interaction. Well, game number 1, it did have the Silumgar Scorns, which were really crucial for keeping that Goldspan Dragon alive as long as they did. However, the Goldspan Dragon wasn't beefy enough, so to speak, to kind of get the damage across. We just kind of saw Goldspan being targeted by removal spell, creating treasure tokens, Silumgar Scorn keeping the Goldspan alive. However, some of these Gruul decks, like the older Gruul Vehicles list, it wasn't running cards like Goldspan Dragon just because the 4 power is not strong enough in a format like Pioneer, which is why we wind up seeing cards like Lovestruck Beast, which is a 5/5, which then eventually became a 6/6 and grew from there with cards in the deck, but then also wind up seeing cards like, I mean, when Questing Beast isn't good enough for that deck anymore, and you start playing things like Sky Sovereign instead for the ETB plus the 6 power, you can kind of see how like these fair costed power and toughness mana cost creatures aren't really going to be able to cut it anymore. Now, if that Goldspan Dragon had hit a turn earlier because of the Sarkhan on the battlefield, we'd be having a different story, because you would have had a Haster swinging in, you would have been on turn 4 instead of turn 5, you would have had the extra treasure making 2 mana to hold up Silumgar Scorn, and it would have been a bit faster, but Charles having the right removal at the right time was just punishing for that line of play from the Dragon's deck.
Yeah, especially since Charles did just hard cast a Vein Ripper. I mean, that does, like, if you're popping off like 1-2 turns early against a potential turn 6 Vein Ripper, it's a big difference.
I mean, that's the hidden mode on Vein Ripper, is that you can play it for 6 mana instead of playing it on turn 3 or 4 off of a Sorin, that a lot of people like to kind of joke about. But that's the reason why the Vampires deck is one of the top decks in Pioneer, and that's why, like, for some people who come in with their brews and try to kind of tech against these specific decks and take them down, it can be frustrating sometimes when those decks don't work out against the meta decks. Maybe it's because you drew the wrong side of your deck, like we saw Eric drawing a bunch of Fatal Pushes against Sorin and Vein Ripper, but in game number 1, it didn't have the closing power against the Vampires deck, which is... This is something I can rant about for a little bit, so feel free to cut me off as soon as we need to go to a commercial break. But when people are designing decks to beat these top decks in Pioneer, Rakdos Vampires, Is It Phoenix, even sometimes like the Niv-to-Light or the Amalia decks, it's not enough to stop the deck from doing what it wants to do once or twice. Yeah. You kind of have this same kind of feeling with modern decks, where it's not enough to just play a Chalice on 0 against the Cascade deck, or previously against the Cascade decks. It's not enough to play a Chalice on 1 against the Prowess decks, because they have these 2 mana spells that can also just kind of dig for a Boseiju or something to get rid of that Chalice. You need to have pressure in addition to an answer for the deck. And while the Goldspan Dragon did apply some pressure in game number 1, Charles drew the part of his deck that was content to just play the removal and disruption game, and it didn't play the Sorin Vein Ripper part, which is what all those Silumgar Scorns were really, really slated to do. And because of that, the clock wasn't fast enough. Charles stabilized at a lower life total, hardcasted the Vein Ripper off of a Cavern of Souls, and the answers that Eric had in hand just weren't able to respond to that line of play anymore.
I mean, yeah, we just saw the Storm God did come out, but unfortunately, yes, the Cavern of Souls, naming Vampires at the right moment, at the right time, getting that card out of his hand as well is also kind of crucial, because let's say he does stabilize later in the game, able to deal with the Vein Ripper, he's still just down a card.
Yeah, exactly. You still wind up being down the card, even if you stabilize. Potentially having things to buff up the dragons and block isn't also the greatest thing, because you still wind up losing 4 life and giving Charles 4 life, which is an entire hit from a Goldspan dragon. So again, you can see this is why some of those cards unfortunately don't see as much Pioneer play, but that doesn't mean that you can't not brew in Pioneer still. What you need to do is you need to have a solid proactive plan from your deck, and then need to have extra cards or sideboard slots, which are those cards that shut things down. Like, let's use Mill for an example, because this is a very easy deck for you to talk about.
Yeah.
You obviously want to get rid of their entire library. You obviously want to try to mill as many things over with cards like Tasha's Hideous Laughter as possible. But when you play against a deck like
Vein Ripper,
you have sideboard cards for that. You have specific cards you bring in while not diluting your main game plan, right?
Yeah, so that's a lot. Like, that's the troubles with the deck building of a lot of the rogue deck, because I probably have never played a meta deck. Like, all I used to play Magic, I've always been like, yeah, I'm playing Taking Turns, I'm playing Mill, I'm playing Merfolk. I'm not. That's one of the biggest like deck building like struggles you do have, is like knowing when to sacrifice a matchup. Yep. Because you can over sideboard. You can over tech for a certain matchup, and then even when you do face it, even with the tech, it's just not enough. So that's the struggle with building rogue decks, is knowing what matchups to give up, what matchups you should be prepped for, because a lot of the matchups you are going to prep for is like, okay, it's a struggle, but I'm gonna at least some of the tech can slow down the deck. Like, for example, like in the middle deck, we're gonna have the extra exchange events, we're gonna have the deadly cover-ups, because you can't, and also as well, like the one off here and there witness protection, you know, those not main sack targets, but being able to sack, like basically sack a crab for witness protection is definitely worth it. Like, that's the struggles of trying to figure out how to win against the top decks.
And I think you kind of really hit the nail on the head there with some of these more off meta deck like the ways they're constructed. You need to identify what your deck is answering in the format from the get-go. Because if you are building a deck because you want to take down the top decks, that means that you're obviously going to have, you know, a Spell Pierce type effect or something if you're a blue deck, because you want to slow down the Soar and Tell combo. But then you still also need card advantage to draw towards your eventual win condition, like something along the lines of, like, maybe we'll see it on stream later, the Grixis Opus deck. You have a control shell, so you have these low mana interactive spells like Dimir is running, but then your top end is red to close out the game a little bit faster than some of those other control decks with the Torrential Gearhulk, Magma Opus, with some other direct damage burn spells that you normally don't see out of those control decks. But that's a matchup that you're building towards. You may be sacrificing something like Amalia or something, because you're not as teched against for exiler removal like a blue-white control deck is. So that's where you kind of look at your matchups, you see what the niche of the meta that you're attacking is, and then you have to decide, how bad are my bad matchups? Like, for me, with the playing the Waste Not deck, I am a big proponent that I am putting cards in my sideboard to make my 50-50 matchups more important for, like, more tech for me. So like 60-40 for me post sideboard. If there's a matchup like Niv to Light, for example, that is like a 30-70 in my favor, I am not bringing in extra cards to try to shore up that matchup. I am looking for optimal lines of play. I'm looking for cards that can overlap with other decks. Like Ashiok is a great card in that matchup because it shuts off Bring to Light. And it's also a very knockout card against Amalia and Phoenix. So that earns a slot in and of itself. But I'm not going to be putting in things to just specifically deal with the Niv to Light matchup because I already think it's a bad matchup. I'm going to focus on the other 92% of the room or the meta to try to shore those matches up a little bit more. And I'm thinking with Eric's deck, main deck Silumgar Scorn, I think, is specifically for like those Sorin Vein Ripper turns. It's also for those Amalia Wildgrowth Walker Collected Company kind of decks. But I'm also interested to kind of see, we didn't only saw Fatal Pushes. We didn't see any sort of Exile removal. We didn't see Leyline Bindings. So I'm also wondering if we're going to wind up seeing things like a Phoenix deck be a little bit better against that deck, where Eric is just kind of relying on the fact that, like, well, my dragons have higher power and toughness.
Yeah, you can't get through.
You don't have lightning axes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, sometimes the best answer to the bad matchups is play your game plan.
Yeah, exactly.
It says you don't really bring in anything. If you face the matchup, you face it. Play your game plan. That sometimes is just your best option than diluting it.
Yeah. So if you are brewing up a deck for Pioneer, of course, don't get discouraged if you run into some of the meta decks. You have a little bit of a hard time. Also, don't get discouraged if you just don't have a positive win rate against the top 5 decks in the room, because Pioneer's at a spot right now that I think Modern was at, like pre-Modern Horizons 2, where it was a little rock, paper, scissors-y.
Yeah.
It's less so now that Mono Green Devotion is gone. Back when Mono Green Devotion was a thing, the format was literally like Mono Green loses to Rakdos, or Mono Green loses to Rakdos. Rakdos can beat up on Phoenix. Phoenix can beat up on... it was like this weird triangle of like top decks. Then even at some point, like Phoenix just completely fell off, and it was just Mono Green, Rakdos, and Greasefang popped up from time to time. So... the format kind of goes through these cycles, and right now in Pioneer, it does kind of feel like, cool, I can't beat every single matchup. And that's what I like about the format, because it means that there's rogue decks come in, they can slide in and take like a corner of whatever local meta you wind up playing in. You have top decks that have very clear weaknesses, but then those clear weaknesses have weaknesses to other decks, so you don't have a 2-deck format like Rakdos Mono Green anymore. You have like a 5-deck format where Vampires, Phoenix, Niv to Light, Waste Not, and I believe the next popular deck is the Prowess deck. Those 5 decks kind of all vie for top spots in the room. Obviously, Phoenix and Vampires have a higher metagame share, but their win rates are in line with those other 5 decks. Those other 3 decks out of that 5.
Yeah. Also, too, like if you're playing like a top meta deck like Phoenix, you are expecting to be teched for the tech against you.
Exactly.
Because I saw at MXC San Francisco, that deck did have a 35% win rate overall, while being like, what was like 20 or so people were playing the deck.
It was not the Pro Tour. That's what it was. It
was not the Pro Tour. Everyone was prepped for it. I mean, I guess an example too, like if you're all going to go to a blind event and you are going to play a road deck, your chances are much, much higher to go far.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, a best example, I built a mill deck in an hour. I literally knew nothing about Pioneer. Go to the 5K because time frame for entry, but the condition was I had to build a mill deck. And I started off 2-1, and I went to 3-1, and then I lost to Amalia.
Well, that also happened a lot back like in that time of Pioneer.
But,
Everybody kind of loses to Amalia.
Pioneer is like the one format where you can probably just play anything and do really well with it.
Yeah, that's what I really like about the format. And funnily enough, I was playing the Waste Not deck for a very long time, and all of a sudden the stars just kind of aligned for that deck. Now, there's no key card that has been printed recently that really made that deck go from like a meme to tier 1. I mean, Sunken Citadel and maybe Deadly Cover Up are the 2 cards that came out that some lists run, but most lists run Extinction Event. Sunken Citadel is great for activating your lands, but it's not a necessity to have every single game. That deck just had the stars align, where these decks started playing things that were Plan A as a combo, whether it's Sorintel, get my Phoenixes and Treasure Cruise online, or Collected Company with Amalia, or Amalia Wildgrowth Walker specifically. So all these decks just needed 2 specific cards, or 3 specific cards. And you know what's really good against that? When they're trying to get those cards in their hand, like discard, and answering the ones that are on the battlefield. So if you have a deck that you're playing that has fallen off and is no longer like a very popular tiered deck, like normal Rakdos mid-range, for example, don't necessarily like sell your cards off and swear off of the deck entirely. Pioneer is a cyclical format. There are releases every 3 months, and as we know that the power level standard has increased and that those standard cards are seeing a ton of play in Pioneer. This looks like show up. But those cards will change the metagame. And if it's every 3 or so months that the decks kind of ebb and flow, I think that's really healthy for the format.